Hello everyone, welcome back to yet another episode of The Art of Code. Thank you for joining me on a very rainy Saturday morning. Today we will be going through what is known as data types. So, what exactly is data types? A good analogy in the real world would be, say for instance, you wanted to categorize your things. So you would kind of have various labels for different things, like for instance clothing, you would have sports equipment, etc. And data types essentially kind of group data into different categories based on what certain properties that they exhibit. So without further ado, let's just dive into the 5 most common data types that you would likely encounter in your first coding session. And they are from left to right: Boolean, integer, floating point, character, and string. So what exactly are these in detail? So I'll just go over each of them quickly. It all depends on what language you're using. The definitions may be a bit different for each, but the rough idea should more or less be the same. So for a Boolean, it essentially is a data type which has 2 states, and it's something like a binary value. So it's only 1 or 0, true or false. For integer, it is like an ordinary integer number, as what we've studied in math. So it is a whole number, and yeah, I think that speaks for itself. A floating point is essentially just a number with decimal places. A character is something like alphabet, but not always, in the sense that it also can be a value, as in a number, but it is something like you writing down a word, not so like it wouldn't be evaluated as a number. It will be evaluated as an alphabet, as though you were writing something in a form. If you were to write, say, my name is Ethan, and then you put a 0 at the end, it's more like a username, and that kind of, because of the alphabets, that the value or the number is also treated as an alphabet in some sense, or more like a word rather than a numerical value. So more on that in respective lessons on specific languages. I don't think the definition of character is very rigid, because there are different languages have different definitions, but that's the rough idea, that a character is a single unit of a symbol, or so to say. And a string is essentially an ordered sequence of characters. So a name is essentially a string if you're defining it in programming. Places, basically anything with word. A word is essentially a string, or perhaps a password, a username, etc. Those are all strings. So now that we know a bit more about data types, let's just go over some important things we must bear in mind when we're dealing with data types. Alright, so the first thing is we need to make sure that we don't perform operations on different data types. For instance, we don't try to add an integer to a string, because that would usually not work out, since what does that mean, adding a number to a word? Like, it doesn't really make sense. Secondly, we need to be aware of the maximum size available for our data type. So in certain languages, the size of the data type is quite limited in some cases, and also in some languages you are expected to give the data type. So when you are trying to do some operations, or when your value is going to exceed a certain size, you need to choose the correct data type to avoid having it overflow, or in some cases even like revert back to 0. For instance, if you run out of space, if you're doing a counter and your variable that's holding the counter is defined with a data type with too little space, it is possible when you increment it again, it goes back to 0, because it's like a loop. So just bear that in mind as well. And last but not least, the most obvious thing that I could say today would be to choose the right data type for the job. And that's something that is really important, that you always bear in mind that you're choosing the right data type for the job, because yeah, there could be some cases where your data types can make or break your application. As mentioned, not all languages even require you to define a data type, but when they do, then this becomes even more important. So that wraps up this video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.